Hello and welcome to this video on the silent killer of contact sports, concussions, or in other words, why you should give up being on the football team and instead join the debate team. A concussion is generally described as a mild brain injury, although calling any brain injury mild seems very blasé. And despite the understatement, concussions are a common injury in many kinds of contact sports. Whether we're talking about boxing, martial arts, football, and more, all lead to concussions. Sometimes these are a common effect of participation, such as the impact of boxing, or due to accidents such as collisions between players in football. The frequency of concussion went without comment for a long time. It's in the last 10 to 20 or so years it's gained traction. The interest has not been without reason. There are many people who play sports that lead to concussion, and this means there is a large number of individuals who have, are, or will experience concussion, and the consequences. As said, concussion is a mild brain injury, but it's caused by a knock or blow to the head, which results in a sudden change in motion. Think about what happens during a car accident. The sudden stop is associated with an impact. That impact throws your head and consequently your brain forward suddenly and violently. Your brain then stops due to the impact with your skull. The result of suddenly having your rather squishy brain contact a solid object like your skull with some speed and force are visible in symptoms of concussion. Common symptoms of concussion are confusion, memory loss, headache, vomiting, and vision or speech problems. All of these down to the fact that you have effectively, inadvertently in most cases, suddenly squished all the neurons in your brain responsible for various activities suddenly and violently with little preparation, and because of this, they suffer damage, sometimes only temporary, sometimes long-term. Most people will fully recover within 2 weeks, although children will take longer, the same with the elderly. They're simply more infirm. Some people will have symptoms for longer, but it's especially true of those who have previously had head injuries. And this is key. There is a smaller number of these same people who have longer-term complications, and they're called persistent post-concussive syndromes. This classification is important because these symptoms will carry on for more than 3 months after the event that caused the injury, or at least the most recent injury. Recovery is all well and good, but now we have to ask what makes concussion insidious and dangerous, especially when we talk about contact sports. First, in order to recover, you're going to have your activities limited. This is pretty much due to the symptoms, so you're going to want to avoid things that are going to provoke or aggravate the symptoms that you have. For example, returning to sports immediately, picking fights in dark alleyways, so on and so forth. You'll then be allowed to go on to a light aerobic exercise, mostly owing to the fact that you don't want to elevate the heart rate too much. Some elevation, yes, because that helps to get the body active and recovering, but you don't want to be doing anything with much intensity. So again, no sports. Then you can begin to exercise in specific ways. Generally speaking, this is going to be rehabilitation back to the activity that you were involved in, but without any kind of contact involved, or else you're likely to get another concussion. Then specific training to the sport or whatever activity that you were injured in, but again without any contact because you still want to avoid the issues of concussion, but you want to be able to fit back into the role you were doing and also get the body back to coordinating and acting in the way you need it to do. Then you get back to practice, but this time you can have full-on contact. So for example, being tackled in football, boxing to some extent, although monitoring needs to be conducted very closely. Not quite so close as anime yanderes, but close enough that if you see any kind of problems, you go back to step 4. Step 6 is basically you go back to normal activities and you act as though nothing has ever happened. You pretty much act like a child with parents who are constantly fighting. You try and ignore it and repress it until it develops into a tumor. The issue with all of this is that people will actually attribute the end of the concussion with full recovery. That is, once they get to step 6, they don't really think much about it. They operate on the basis that they've recovered and they can go back to whatever they were doing, and this leads to the possibility, and in many cases, a probable repetition of the events that led to the existing concussion. This is where things get problematic. Once you have one concussion, it's probably not going to be a major issue. If you have a second concussion, sure, you're showing negligence, but it happens. 3, 4, and even more, now you have an issue, as you actually begin to cause physical brain damage, and brain damage that can be observed in different ways. Admittedly, the various models that have been used haven't always been great. Some are kinda questionable, but in other instances they have actual brains from individuals who have donated their body to science, and they've looked at what's happened after multiple concussions, and it's not pretty. For example, using a rodent model where they basically gave brain injuries to the rodents, they found that the neurons that were involved were damaged. The neurons themselves, but specifically the axon. And this was still prevalent in the brain of the rodent 3 to 6 months after the injury occurred. And that's why we mention, dismissing it after recovery after just one injury isn't really true. In fact, there is evidence from that same study showing that there's still degenerative processes going on in the brain for up to 24 months after the injury occurs. So that tells you it takes at least 2 years to get thorough recovery. And that's only what they found looking at it in a rodent model. The human brain is much larger and arguably far more complex. There's also evidence that concussions will lead to tau pathologies, similar to what you see in Alzheimer's disease. Admittedly, again, we see this in rodent models, and these studies were, well, initially they were using anesthetized mice, and then they decided that anesthesia might not be a great idea. So they used unanesthetized mice, which, yeah, that one had to have been a real challenge for the ethics board to approve. But importantly, they also found similar long-term damage up to about 6 months post-injury. But importantly, the actual impact or concussion itself led to the development of those tau protein pathologies within 24 hours. We then have how the brain actually responds to the trauma itself. Trauma in this case simply being the concussion. It's inflammation because you have damaged the brain, and the way the body responds to any kind of damage full stop is inflammation. But neuroinflammation is a problem, because it is known to be closely associated with various neurodegenerative diseases, and particularly the activation of the microglia. This leads to parts of the brain becoming more permeable to allow for waste to be disposed of, new nutrients to be brought in, and for a whole process to happen that is then, at least in theory, associated with things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and all sorts of other problems that happen. All of this is tied into concussions, and of course is why social sports are terrible. You should instead play solitary sports like archery or chess, but that's not the point. The point is that contact sports lead to concussion. While a rare event, it is still common enough and possibly regular enough to lead to serious consequences. This is also why you will be seeing in a lot of sports that people are increasingly being forced to wear the skull caps. Those padded dome helmet type things. They're there to help to reduce the severity of impact to the head and thereby reduce the possibility of concussion, simply because the increasing recognition of the long-term and rather serious issues from concussion are not insignificant. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.